Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us tonight one of Macon's great young intellects. Did I say young intellects?
Well, less young every year, but...
Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck.
Glad to be here.
And I know the political season has not quite expired. We have another election coming in Georgia, and there's a lot of discussion about voting, voting rights, voting suppression, the role of the states in this whole process. But maybe we could discuss that a bit as to how the voting rolls have been expanded for centuries. Mm-hmm. Is that a fair statement? I mean,
oh, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
If we take our discussion back to medieval times, there was really the powerful king and the nobles kind of ran things, and the lesser folk had no role in arrangements. And then through a long, convoluted process in England, in any event, I think it's fair to say that the little people that weren't too little had a voice in the House of Commons. And I think there was a substantial property requirement, or you had to pay taxes to have a vote. And there were all kinds of corruptions, rotten boroughs. People could easily manipulate the government. And so for a long time, that was the way the situation was. And in some ways, that absence of voter participation had a role in the American Revolution, that people thought they were not getting a fair shake, particularly in regards to taxes. And so if you pay taxes, everything is centered on property. And therefore you have a right to determine where the taxes go. But if you don't pay taxes, then presumably there's not such a privilege. A particularly germane issue when, at least in the U.S., about more or less 50% of the population, they do not pay income taxes. But sailing the ship into the good old USA, can we just discuss a little bit as to how the voting rolls have been expanded and the logic by which in our country the privilege of voting has evolved and come to our present state of affairs?
Well, I think if you're talking about the massive expansion of voting that began in the 1800s under Jacksonian democracy, there's the good reason why it expanded and there's the real reason why it expanded. But we can take it back earlier than that. Of course, we would need Dr. Andrew Reeves, who's been a guest on some of your shows, to talk about the development of the English barons and the property owners. So the idea of representative government just didn't really exist in the High Middle Ages, and it very much was about property and the competing property interests involved in England. But over time, as you saw a gentry emerge and a middle class emerge, and the idea that well, if the laws have an impact on me, I should be able to have an input into the laws took hold. Then, of course, you get the Bill of Rights, 1689, and one of the things that enshrined was the taxation and representation issue. And of course, taxation is about property. And so when you get to the period in the British colonies after the 7 Years' War, and Parliament decides, well, who benefited in all the British Empire that we have won and secured in this first true global conflict against France and the allies of France? Which British subjects benefited more than any others? Well, the Americans, the members of the 13 North American colonies, because France has been gotten out of their backyard, they can now expand west, they can subdue all this property. Then they ought to be the ones to make at least some contribution to this massive national debt that we build up beating France. And so they started trying to tax the colonists. And the colonists, who were essentially smuggling, then looked into their history books and law books and found this wonderful statement from the Bill of Rights 100 years earlier: no taxation without representation. And we ought not take that as an idea of mass representation. It was that because that concept did not exist until the French Revolution. But the idea that there was no one in Parliament who was actually from the North American colonies, and therefore could not speak to the particular economic interests of those colonies. And that's what it was meant. It wasn't that everyone has the right to vote, or even every colonist has the right to vote. But that was a step forward in the idea that, well, if the law affects me, I should have some sort of voice in the law.
Actually, relatively few people did in the colonies.
Very few.
So a big statement is democracy, whatever, democracy, republic. We've always been a democracy. We've always had the situation that we were fighting for freedom, whatever that means, in the Revolutionary War. But actually, there were a huge population were held in bondage. And certainly females could not vote, and the property restrictions were quite substantial. So a relatively small number of people could vote. But having said that, I think one of the issues out there is that at that time, the power of the state was, I guess, preservation of property. And also some kind of protection of life and limb. That's what the state did.
Public order.
That's right. And relatively, I would submit, little else. Mm-hmm. So if you, it's true enough that I don't have any money, and there's the state is there, but the state doesn't really matter to me, other than it might put me in jail, it might do this, it might do that, it might declare war, but it's not going to do much for me one way or the other. And so only one of the substantial things that has happened, I believe, is the power of the state to redistribute wealth and property has become much greater as centuries have gone along. And that, maybe we could discuss that a little bit. The present, the way the electorate has been expanded, has been tremendously expanded. And so many people that are in bad economic circumstances now have the power to vote, and their representatives can push for property redistribution. Which is something that in the Revolutionary War, I don't think it was an intended event, although in practicality, what happened was the loyalists everything was confiscated. Yes. So many people, if they were on the right side, got a windfall, yes, a huge windfall from these wars. And often that happened, you could say. For instance, in the American Civil War, the property owners in the North had a tremendous amount of prosperity referable to the war. They could sell, shoes and guns, and the economic circumstances really made them flourish. Mm-hmm. So can we go through a little bit as to how property became less of a marker for suffrage? Yes. And just being a human became more and more, and the barriers that might have been erected for property went. And also some degree of literacy that went. And then another thing was just the whether you'd been born in the country or not born in the country, your religious proclivities, et cetera, maybe we could discuss that, because that turns out to be a big deal, doesn't it?
Yes. Well, I think all that ultimately traces back to the French Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and the notion of the more radical elements of the French Revolution, that the great mass of Frenchmen and women, and ultimately the great mass of Westerners and the great mass of the world's population are not just along for the ride. It is not the country is not the property of the kings and the handful of nobles. It is the property of everyone who lives there, and who are contributing to the wealth, but the wealth is being taxed away by the state, ultimately for the good of and benefit of the nobles. And that is largely what produced the French Revolution and this idea of mass democracy. And then the United States sort of picked up the strains of this about 30 years later with Jacksonianism. And this is where we get from the real reason and the good reason. The good reason given in the Jacksonian years were that, once again, if you live under the law, you should have an input into that law. The real reason was it was a sheer numbers game, that the Jackson supporters knew that Jackson was essentially America's first pop hero, and that the more you expanded the suffrage, the more likely it was that Jackson would win the presidential election. And that was a brilliant calculation. It worked perfectly. And that's what swept Jackson into the White House in 1828. And from there, we've never looked back.
You know, and interesting, I'm not an expert on this, but it would appear to me one of the interesting things about the evolution of the American democratic system would be we mentioned property, but the distribution of property. So, for instance, what was the wealth situation, say, in Jacksonian Tennessee versus Rhode Island? Mm-hmm. Were there lots of rich people in Rhode Island, or were there where was the wealth? Where was that?
I can't tell you in the Jacksonian years, but I can tell you about 40 years later, on the eve of the Civil War, because one of the things you like to look at when a war is about to start are the advantages and disadvantages that each side has. That although Southern slave-produced cotton accounted for, on the eve of the Civil War, very close to 2/3 of the dollar value of our exports, the slaves themselves certainly didn't share in that. No. And interestingly enough, the white South taken as a whole didn't share very largely in that either. Now, northern shippers and northern manufacturers shared in it very much. And one of the fascinating statistics of the war is that the banks of Rhode Island had more liquid capital available to them than all of the banks in the seceded states combined. And that tells you something right there.
So that's right. So beneath the surface, there are these property issues. Now, in looking at our present set of circumstances, we have elections, and there are calls of voter suppression, the role of the states in this whole process. But doesn't the Constitution, maybe we can speak about that, what federal assurances exist that a person has the right to vote anywhere under any circumstances, and what are the roles of the state, the individual states, in determining the process or procedures by which people vote?
Well, to begin with, there is no universal right to vote set forth in the Constitution. There's not even a close to universal right to vote. Most of the constitutional provisions dealing with the right to vote are of two sorts. Number one, they are either prohibitions on restricting the vote, which is different from guaranteeing a right to vote, or they're a more general statement that the courts have construed to apply to voting. So as an example of the first, I will give you the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, and the 26th Amendment. The 15th Amendment is one of the Reconstruction Amendments, and it does not say African Americans or any persons of color have the right to vote. It does not say that. It says that if the state is going to deny an individual the vote, then the reason for that denial must not be race-based. So
but it could be property, or
it could be many other
literacy.
things.
It could
yes.
be,
and the way I like to do this to show the difference in class is I will pick out an African American student and I'll say, "How old are you?" And ideally, I get the answer, "I'm 17 or 16."
Whatever, right.
And if not, then I'll say, "Well, do you have a younger brother or sister?" And they say, "Yeah." "How old is he?" "Well, 12 years old." "Can he vote?" "No." "Oh, well, that must violate the 15th Amendment, right?" "No, it does not." "Well, he's black and he can't vote." "Yeah, but he can't vote because he's 15.
That's the reason,
Yeah. The 19th Amendment, once again, is written in very similar language. If you're going to be denied the right to vote, it can't be because you're female. And then finally, the 26th Amendment, if you're going to be denied the right to vote, it cannot be due to age. 18.
What about older people? I know it says 18, but does it expand the statement to say, even if you're quite demented, which I think could be an issue, that many people, as their cognitive ability has declined so much that they are unaware of the circumstances around them and could easily be manipulated. Yes.
So nothing like that.
No. Well, just ask the question, could we say, well, you're 75, you're presumably going in the last quarter of life, assuming each quarter is 25. Well, if you go in the fourth quarter, you can't vote. I mean, could someone attempt to do that?
Well, it's interesting because, once again, I don't know of any specific provisions that would prevent that. Now, there could be challenges on more general constitutional grounds, and the one that immediately comes to mind would be the Equal Protection Clause. Nor shall any state deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. That is an extremely important constitutional provision. It was added in the wake of the Civil War. It was added in 1868. But if you'll stop and reflect on it for a minute, this phrase equal protection of the laws, which is very high sounding and very noble sounding, is in a way can be just as vague as the word liberty.
Yes.
It sounds great, but what exactly does it mean? So it has had some voting impacts before. The famous case of Baker versus Carr, and which was an anti-gerrymandering case, came out in the mid-1950s, in which you had some very small districts in terms of population and some very big districts, which meant that if you lived in a small district, your vote had a much bigger impact than the voters who live in a very big, highly populous district. And so Baker versus Carr said, no, you can't do that, that one man's vote, as near as practicable, ought to be equal to another man's vote. And nowadays, of course, we gender neutral it, so it's one person, one vote.
Well, of course, the senatorial situation being what it is, I mean, if you live in Wyoming, your vote counts more than California.
Yes, but that's hardwired into the Constitution, right. So that's different.
Now, we're sort of getting into a subject about the subtle restrictions on suffrage. And what about gerrymandering? And I think in New York there was a recent deal where the Democrats presumably lost a number of congressional seats because they attempted to gerrymander the districts for their advantage, and by some kind of arcane way, the courts or someone struck this down and made things less gerrymandered. Can you speak to that? Is it possible to gerrymander stuff, and does that happen? And we finally get to the role the states have in, as they play these games, as political parties play the games, about the way they attempt to influence the suffrage rights.
Yes. Well, once again, gerrymandering, the states can draw the districts how they wish as long as that does not violate the federal Constitution, and that is where the Equal Protection Clause comes in, that if the numbers are too badly out of whack from one district to another, then the Supreme Court or any federal court at this point, acting on Supreme Court precedent, is going to say, no, that's violating the Baker principle, one person, one vote. So also, if it becomes clear, and I'm not an election law specialist, but if it becomes clear that the state legislature has drawn the districts in a way to try to make sure that, for instance, no African Americans will get elected to the House of Representatives from any of the congressional districts, then that would also involve an equal protection claim, regardless of whether or not the districts are of equal size. So,
well, that's a rather complicated story, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, and maybe the major principle is the Constitution gives states, we mentioned the federal situation, but the Constitution gives states a lot of clout about how they do their voting issues.
Yes.
As witnessed, I think, in our senatorial runoff election that's coming, and other states don't do it that way. And presumably the states have the ability to do things like that. We want, or I think Alaska is experimenting with votes that are, I guess, you vote for, your first, third, fifth, seventh choice, and they have a mechanism by which they come to a conclusion. But your second choice has a role in this. That in sort of a novel way they did it. But so these experiments are out there, and the takeaway message is the states can really do a lot, can they not?
They can. Well, one of the great examples of this is the Electoral College, and the question becomes, how does a state choose its electors? Well, the Constitution has very little to say about that, and in fact, the way the Electoral College began was that the first years under the U.S. Constitution were that the state legislatures chose the electors. And there is right now nothing in the Constitution I'm aware of, unless you want to try to leverage, once again, the Equal Protection Clause or the Due Process Clause, which are not specifically geared to elections. They're just sort of general clauses. But if Georgia today wanted to pass a law saying that Georgia is going to choose its presidential electors based on what the state legislature wants, disenfranchise the state's voters when it comes to presidential election, Georgia could do it. Now, would Georgia do it? No. If Georgia tried to do it, would the voting population vote that state legislature out? Of course they would. But Georgia does have technically that authority in the Constitution. Every state does.
Now, I think there was a dispute in the last election about, everyone's quite aware of this, about former President Trump and who really won the election. And a alternative group of electors that were pledged to him, I think. Now, if you're an elector, how do we get the electors to Electoral College now? Do you happen to know? I don't.
Yeah. Well, you mean
now?
Well, two possible. Are you asking how the Republican Party chooses its electors?
Well, does each party choose a set of electors?
Yes. Yeah. And you have to remember that a political party is not part of the government. It's a private association.
Yes.
Now, it's a very huge private association.
Yes.
But when you go into the voting booth and vote for Trump or Biden, you are not actually voting for Trump or Biden. You are voting for a slate of electors put forward by the political party in question. So, and this is the way that it's done in practically every state, that if more voters in Georgia vote for Biden or vote for the Democratic Party than vote for Trump or the Republican Party, then the slate of Democratic electors are elected. And being Democrats, presumably they will cast their ballots for Biden rather than for Trump.
And who arbitrates that?
The party.
Well, what I'm thinking about, and I don't understand all the nuances of this, but apparently there's a investigation of the efforts of former President Trump to overturn the election, and there are many. The idea of this a conspiracy, and there's lots of people that presumably might go to jail by trying to circumvent the Constitution or overthrow the American people, if one you say it that way. But as my understanding is that if you were a Republican elector and you were selected by the party and you had the minority number of votes and you still were trying to cast your votes, would that be legal? I could ask that question. The people that were Republican electors, supposedly, are in a lot of trouble because they attempted to, after the election, put forward their votes somehow. I might not quite know the circumstances.
I'm not tracking on that, and I haven't heard that.
Well, no, it's true because the lieutenant governor, or the president, the elected lieutenant governor, was one of those people that had that were a national elector, and somehow the idea is they were inappropriately, after they had lost, the Republicans had not won the state, they were still presuming to try and vote for Trump.
Yes.
Even though they were technically didn't have that privilege.
Yes.
And so if they attempted to do that, they might be some kind of trouble that they find themselves in.
I just don't even see how they could do that, because what's going to happen is he's not an elector at all. He's a potential elector,
Right.
unless the Republican Party wins the popular vote in Georgia.
Yes.
That is determined by the Secretary of State, and of course, Brian Kemp was Secretary of State.
Yes.
I think when he was running against Stacey Abrams.
Right.
But yeah, so the Secretary of State's going to say
it is a far. It is a far stretch, but in general, I mean, this investigation that's underway, that people, and I think it's costing legal issues, legal expenses, and so the net to try and I guess punch it out after the election between the two parties. Some people are being pulled into the jaws of this controversy.
Well, I can't say how they do it, because the way it happens in Georgia is that on such and such a day, the electors who have been duly elected and contacted, presumably directly by the Secretary of State's office, will meet in the Georgia Senate chamber. Roll is taken, they cast their two ballots, one for president and one for vice president. And if you're the Republican elector at that stage and you try to go into the Senate chamber, they're just going to say, we don't recognize you. You're not.
Well, maybe, and so the crucial player in this would be the Secretary of State. Is that the crucial player?
Yes.
And so if there was a corrupt Secretary of State and there was a tight election, presumably he could attempt to sail the ship in the wrong direction.
Well, this is, hence, Trump's telephone call saying, can't you find 31,000 more votes?
Yes.
So, which is, I mean, there's several levels. Number one, Trump trying to get Pence simply to say, I'm not going to count these ballots. Trump telling, or perhaps pressuring or suggesting that his people march to the Capitol to make their displeasure known. Trump calling, saying, can't you find some votes somewhere? Those are three different situations. I think if it is that close and the Secretary of State really can't think the call, I think it's going to be obvious. I mean, the next stage would be, well, then the problem must be somebody has infected the software of the voting machines. But the way you're going to do that, the Secretary of State's going to say, no, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to come into this chamber and cast a vote, so you bring a lawsuit.
So I think one of the issues that's important is to get our voting arrangements so well established that there's no dispute about it.
And that's impossible.
Well, as much as can be done. I mean, it's so if there's, votes are being challenged, not challenged, and maybe we've got not a lot of time left, but maybe we can chat a little bit about the way that, because the electorate is so widely distributed, that's a big deal. Including, I think felons can still not vote.
In most places. There's a movement in some states.
Right. I think some states can. I don't think they can in Georgia, and that's a substantial number of people. I don't know if there are any other disqualifications much. But the voting arrangements are the way to vote has been extended so much that many people say, well, is this too much? So we have early voting, you send ballots in, and traditionally, I would say for long periods of time, as I can recollect it, the votes were, you had to vote on election day, and if there was some reason that you couldn't vote, maybe you could get a special dispensation to send an absentee ballot in. But it was quite hard to do.
Well, I have plenty to say on that, but I know we're running out of time. So my final general comment would be that if all sides are not willing to lose an election and take one for the team and put a dispute to bed for the greater good of the country, there is no law and no provision and no mechanism in place that will protect us. That's what it comes down to.
So it sort of depends on the goodwill of the American people.
Absolutely it does.
So if that's the crucial thing. People have a sense of fairness, and they accept this is what happened. Our team lost.
Yeah.
We'll do better next time.
And this and that goodwill is wearing very, very
Yes,
thin
it is.
lately.
Very dangerous situation. Well, thank you for being here once
Thank
again,
you
Buck.
always,
I
sir.
wish you well as
Indeed.
you go forward in life.
Right.
Okay, good. Take care.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.